Welcome to AP World History Unit 1 Test Prep. This unit covers everything from 1200 to 1450 AD by Ariamon, Oni, Paul, and Elias. And your speaker right now is Paul Bailey. And basically, the introduction to the topic, you the reader should be able to absorb all the information needed. These slides give a background on the civilizations that existed in the post-classical era and provide a contextualization to modern history. That will begin to unfold for you in the following months. There are a total of 6 units plus a comparison at the end, which is between East Asia and Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. There is developments in East Asia, the House of Islam, South and Southeast Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Europe. The discussion topics and the general structure throughout, that will be constant throughout the slideshow, will be a regional timeline, content, a comparison, which will be at the end of the show, or slideshow, and this global contextualization, and 2 bookends that go over the beginning and end of the time period. Unit 1.1, Southeast Asia, the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties from 1200 to 1450. If I mispronounce the names of the dynasties, I don't think it'll matter too much, because I'm sure they won't be on the test. So, you'll live. Bookend number 1, in East Asia. After the Han fell in 220 AD, several years of disarray and unorganized, non-existent governments existed throughout China. For almost a staggering 200 years, China was left without a real government. However, this disarray would lead China to the era of the 6 dynasties. The Sui dynasties built the Grand Canal, which became the backbone of China, which increased the trade and economy for really just the next 6 dynasties that were to rule there. In our timeline, the Sui dynasty lasted the shortest of the 3 dynasties during this time period. However, they paved the way for the Tang and Sung dynasties for success. They created many grand structures, including the Grand Canal, that in the long run would increase trade efficiency and communication throughout ancient China. This goes on to do a number of things, which obviously stated in the text, is that it increases the trade efficiency, but not just this, but it also spread ideologies and philosophies and religious beliefs throughout China. The Tang dynasty, Chinese culture and traditions had reached its peak. Internal expansion made the Tang dynasty one of the biggest and most prominent dynasties to have ever existed. Eventually, armies sought out weakness within the empire, eventually bringing it to its demise. The Sung dynasty was prominent as well, although not as prominent as the Tang, which is important to mention. Their military base was incredibly strong, not allowing smaller armies to take advantage of them, except for the Mongols, which they would teach the Mongols about gunpowder, and ironically, the Mongols would soon after use gunpowder to, make the Sung dynasty fall to the ground. Our timeline, which spans all the way from 100 to 1600 AD, starts at 100 AD on the far left, which begins with the Buddhist penetration of China and the era of anarchy and division, from 150 to 540 AD, and the Buddhist penetration lasting all the way till 690 AD. The construction of the Grand Canal from 510 to 540 AD, and the invention of the woodblock printing. These both would increase the communications, it's about to say worldwide, but it's more just Southeast Asia-wide. The creation of the civil service entrance exam, which I'll get into later, basically just allows more diversity within the social structure. And then the Tang dynasty from 560 to 710, and then gunpowder finds a lead use. Then the Sung dynasty is created from 920 to 1250 AD. Then the Mongol dynasty, I say dynasty in quotation marks because it's more of a nomadic tribe, a massive one at that, comes to power and destroys the Sung dynasty. And then the Ming dynasty comes into power at 1340 and lasts all the way to 1590 AD, existing off the backbones of really all the dynasties that have come before them, using their technologies, cultures, and ideologies and innovations. The global context for East Asia for this period was the revival of a meritocracy system, I'm not sure if I said that right, and the trade which came with the revival of the Silk Roads and oceanic trade. In the broader context, a true global trade emerges after it faded with the fall of the Han, as many people were really just too scared to trade because of that unorganization. A continuity during this period of the Confucius beliefs. New religions like Buddhism infilter, but Confucianism continues as the basic fiber, even though a syncretic religion emerges. One such religion is Neo-Confucianism, which is a blend of Old Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism, which I will get into more. But really, these were the two main religions that everybody believed in during this time period, and Daoism being the main philosophy at this time. And once Buddhism started slowly dying out, that's really when Neo-Confucianism surged throughout the new dynasties. And this leads us to Persia. P for politics. Civil services were an important part of the bureaucratic structure throughout the three dynasties. The Sung dynasty eliminated the corruption that had crept into the bureaucracy by making the exam accessible to all. This meant there was really no way to make it corrupt, because there was so much diversity. It would be almost impossible, because everybody that took the test and passed it was a part of that social structure. Economics. Because of the Sui creating Grand Canal, trade was much easier as the 14,000-mile trade route was created. This increase in availability brought the economy to a much finer point, and it was well stabilized, and products could travel from north to south with relative ease. Paper money, credit, and banking systems were introduced during the Sung, which helped to expand trade. Not just the Grand Canal was increasing trade, but it was also allowing religion and different cultures and ideologies go with the people whom were trading. R for religion. Buddhism that came through Silk Roads, like I just mentioned, and maritime trade routes, such as the Grand Canal, became the religion of many millions of people during the Tang, while Confucianism and Daoism had been prominent earlier in China. With the Sung dynasty, Confucianism saw a revival in the form of Neo-Confucianism after Buddhism had finally slowed down significantly, which carried elements of all three religions, that being Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism, obviously, which this became even more prominent as the civil service exam tested the scholars on their knowledge of those religions, and they had to think more in depth about it. So S for societies. Families had a joint family structure with 3 generations living under one roof, this like being the modern-day nuclear family. Women had to provide a male heir, otherwise men could remarry. Women did not hold the same status as men, which would unfortunately become a constant tradition for many centuries to come. Foot binding and dowry system existed under the Sung. Filial piety, I probably didn't pronounce that right either, was viewed as a virtue above all other moral obligations. I for technology and innovation. Innovation is always key for a thriving society and is something the post-classical Chinese dynasties usually did well. For example, they found rice that could withstand drought and had massive farming yields. This was called the champa rice and was a massive part of the population boom in the 11th to 12th century. Astrolabe and lug sail for junks helped with trade. Gunpowder was invented, which reached the Arabs in 1100 after death. Printing was invented during the Song when it was used for paper money besides books. A for art. Art was a big part of the Chinese culture as they wanted to pay honor to their beliefs. They would write poems or create paintings that visualized their beliefs. They even had a golden age of poems during the Tang Dynasty reign. Life offered a lot more entertainment and opportunities than really ever existed. Bookend number 2 for East Asia. The Sung dynasty eventually fell to the Mongols, a nomadic dynasty that was incredibly powerful and that their military had been completely unmatched. After the Mongols would go on to conquer many different dynasties and civilizations, this being all the way up north, far into Russia, and spreading a little bit into Europe as well. For the first time, this region is occupied, that being Southeast Asia, by people with a different religion than those of the Hans, that being Buddhism. The Mongols learned about the very destructive material gunpowder from the Sung dynasty I had previously stated, which in return they used to conquer them a few short years later. And this conclusion of Unit 1.1 leads us to
Unit 1.2, Dar al-Islam. Bookend 1. With Prophet Muhammad, Islam gains followers and the Ummah group is established and the Muslim empire gains relevance. After the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, despite separation between the Shias and the Sunnis, Abu Bakr as-Sunni becomes the caliph and successor. Islam spreads rapidly under the subsequent four caliphs. The first state to evolve is the Umayyads, with its capital at Damascus in Syria. The Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads, and the Umayyads were thus limited to Spain, following which the Abbasid Empire begins to fragment. However, trade thrives. Timeline: Dar al-Islam. So in the timeline there are 5 major points I would like to point out. The first is in 830 AD, when the House of Wisdom is founded. The second ranges from 750 AD to 1258 AD. It is the translation movement. This was a major time when learning was prevalent. Then the third was from 756 to 1031 AD. At this point, the Umayyads had control of Cordoba, Spain, under al-Andalus. The Umayyads also made this a cultural melting point. The fourth, from 1192 to 1512 AD. The Mamluks had established the Delhi Sultanate in this time period. This is when the cultural renaissance in India begins. In 1305 AD, a compendium of chronicles is published. In 1326, Travels of Ibn Battuta is published. CCOT, Dar al-Islam. The global context for this period includes the rise of Islam. With the downfall of the Byzantine and Sassanid or the Persian Empire, because Islam was rooted in the Judeo-Christian religion, it begins to spread rapidly throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain under the vast empire of the Umayyad Caliphate and subsequently the Abbasids. Islam blends the role of religion and government together. Extensive trade in the region creates distinct cultural influence and interaction. Prominent learning centers emerge in Cordoba, Timbuktu, Cairo, and Bukhara. Arabic becomes the official language for the administration and helps to spread Islam. Over time, new languages emerge as Arabic blends with regional ones, such as Swahili and Urdu. Syncretic beliefs, such as Sufism, Bhakti movement, and Sikhism appear. A continuity during this period is the position of women. As per Islamic beliefs, all men are created equal in the eyes of God. However, because of economic reasons, patriarchy is still intact. Women have more freedom compared to other cultures. However, they do not have political or economic opportunities. Persia. Politically, the Caliphate was a semi-religious political system of governance in Islam. Seljuk Turks established the Sultanate. The rulers actively sought converts and imposed jizya, which was a tax on non-Islamic population. People of the book were not taxed, and non-Muslims who joined military service were exempted from jizya. Under Islamic empires, the Sharia law system prevailed as per which Islam was God's command for Muslims. Economics. The Silk Roads were re-established, stretching from West Africa and the Middle East to China. Dhows with slender hulls were used for trade along the Indian Ocean trade routes. Merchants held a position of prestige, acted as missionaries, and gave charity and fair dealings. This led to urban prosperity as merchants made fortunes with demands for goods from India and China, leading to the Classical period. Baghdad became the economic hub under the Abbasids, but as the trade routes shifted north, Baghdad fell into decay. Religion. Though proselytization occurred in Islam, it was not as successful in India. Lower caste Hindus and Buddhists converted to Islam to improve their life. In other regions, slaves could earn their freedom by converting to Islam. Sufism was focused on introspection and had emerged as a result of the Umayyad love for luxury. Sufis were largely responsible for the spread of Islamic beliefs east. Society. In Islam, there was a single social class. Slaves were brought from the Kievan Rus, Africa, and Central Asia. At this time, there was no hereditary slavery. Concubines could earn and buy freedom, unlike those who were in China. Polygamy was not uncommon. Islamic women enjoyed a better status, since the hijab and harems were only imposed with urbanization in the Middle East. In India, women had more independence, and the pattern continued as they converted to Islam. Innovation. As the House of Wisdom and other centers of learning revived, they garnered and compiled knowledge to make it available to the world. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, books on mathematical concepts, were among the texts. The first observatory was constructed in Baghdad, and a subsequent one in Damascus. The Islamic world learned of paper, printing, and bookbinding from the Chinese and made these available to the world. Art. Calligraphy had found its way in sacred texts, since human forms could not be depicted in Islamic works. Geometrical architecture found its way in palaces and mosques. Indo-Muslim fusion brought the Indian cultural renaissance, leaving lasting moments in architecture, music, literature, and religion. Works of Sufi philosopher-poets Rumi and Rabia Basri are popular even today. Bookend 2. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 results in the final destruction of the decaying of the learning center. The Mongols bring Arab and Turkish rule to an end by conquering the last of the Arabids in order to establish the Ilkhanate in the region, the last of the Lodi and the Delhi Sultanate to establish the Mughal Empire, and they just stop short at Egypt, the region controlled by the Mamluks. The Ottomans later occupied the Mamluk region in Egypt and Syria in 1517. Unit 1.3 India and South Asia. Bookend number 1. Northern and Southern India have different political structures post-classical period. The caste system is prominent in India, a continuity in both northern and southern India, with rigid layers in the society. Northern India gets occupied by the Ghazni, which brings Islam to India, following which the Delhi Sultanate is established by the Mamluk Turks. Syncretic religions and conversion to Islam bring some respite to the people of the lower class. Timeline. There are 5 important milestones. From 320 to 550 AD, the Gupta dynasty brings in the Golden Era. It was the last large unified empire in northern India. Further to the decline of the Gupta Empire, segregated small Rajput kingdoms arose. 510 to 620 AD. The Temple of Borobudur is the largest Buddhist temple in the world. It shows the reach of Buddhism in the region. 1001 to 1025 AD. Mahmud of Ghazni repeatedly invaded India to loot and plunder. 1122 to 1150 AD. The building of Angkor Wat was built over a period of 28 years, over which the kingdom showed advancements in technology and political governance. 1398 AD. The invasion led by Tamerlane results in the end of the Mamluks. Mongol rule started in India. The Mughal rule brings almost the entire Indian subcontinent under one domain, drawing the subcontinent's regions together through enhanced overland and coastal trading networks. CCOT. Global context for this period is that regions in proximity to China and trading with China undergo strong Chinese influence. Regions in Southeast Asia are affected by India in its west and China in the north. Many sea-based kingdoms near Southwest Asia grew to be tremendously wealthy and more powerful. During this period, interactions with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam play an important role in shaping the societies of India and South Asia as well. A continuity during this period in this region is the caste system, despite Buddhism, which rose in North India in 500 BC and preached simplicity and nonviolence. Islam, which first came to South Asia in 700 AD, preached equality in the eyes of God. As people from lower castes converted to Islam, they find that they continue to not have an economic and educational opportunities. Persia. Politics. South Asia was largely decentralized during this era, with many separate kingdoms and sultanates, when compared to the later British rule or the Song dynasty in China. In North India, the Rajputs coexisted with the Delhi Sultanate, a Muslim state, with a tribute system from the Rajputs. The Khmer Empire ruled a large portion of Southeast Asia from the 9th to 15th centuries. Economics. Indian culture influenced the government and the culture of Southeast Asia. Trade and taxes brought in prosperity for rulers in India. Angkor Wat was primarily an agricultural economy controlled by the ruler. Elite and rulers occupied most of the wealth. For example, one Maharaja had over 100,000 soldiers in his pay, 900 elephants, and 20,000 horses. This was off a relatively small state. Trade, agricultural, mines, and vast crown lands were where the money came from. Religion. Muslim rulers were relatively tolerant of other faiths if they were peaceful. The conversion of Islam was greatly encouraged since it would lessen taxes, and this encouragement helped 1 million Hindus convert. The Bhakti movement, a mystical movement similar to Sufi rises, focused on self-introspection and equality for women and lower classes. Buddhism and Hinduism also spread to South Asia through trade and missionaries. Society. Establishment of Muslim rule over the northern parts of the subcontinent had a significant impact on the society and culture of the Indian people. Women had relative freedom prior to Islam, and with the coming of Islam their original status continued. Innovation, intellectual activity, and interaction with the Middle East created advancements, including mathematics. For example, Arabic numerals have origin in Indian numerals. Angkor Wat was a floating city, with water channels around the city to help with irrigation and keep outsiders at bay. This also helped with the monsoon winds. People of this time period were able to advance knowledge on architecture, agriculture, and technology, how to have a stable economy, language, and mathematics. Art. Blended architecture with Islamic and Persian influence from the north can be seen in Indian cities. Syncretic languages like Urdu arose, and Gurwat architecture showed the Hindu and Buddhist influences. Bookend number 2. This period closes with largely decentralized governments. A patchwork of different types of societies, religions, and cultures make up the society. Different languages and scripts exist due to influence of vast differences in each region. This sets the stage for the next era, Mughal, and then under the British rule. Unit 1.4, The Americas. Bookend number 1. Originating from the inhabitants of Teotihuacan in Mexico City were two major civilizations. The Mayans arose from the Olmecs near the lowlands of the Gulf of Mexico and settled in the Yucatan Peninsula sometime around 1050 AD. The Aztecs settled in the Valley of Mexico sometime in 1100 AD as far south as the Guatemalan border. Incas were primarily a single dynasty rule that emerged in late 1300 AD near Cusco in the mountains of southern Peru. In the timeline, there are 5 monumental moments. From 1190 to 1260 AD, the largest slip dwellings in the Americas, the Mesa Verde, was built. The painted murals gave an insight into the life of the Pueblo people. 1325, the Aztecs founded Tenochtitlan on Lake Texaco. It was built on 2 islands, and the area was extended by placing chinampas, small artificial islands, on the lake. 1450 AD was built Machu Picchu, which was an example of technological expertise. This town was built by Emperor Pachacuti. 1493 AD, this began as a small tribe, and through strong alliances and military alliances, they gained land. Huayna Capac consolidated the Inca Empire into 4 provinces, each with its own governor. In 1519, the Aztecs fell to Hernando Cortez, and in 1533, the Incas fell to Francisco Pizarro. Aiding the conquistador attacks were starvation, disease, and civil wars. CCOT. In the Americas during this period, the Aztecs and the Inca emerged as large, thriving empires that united the people of Mesoamerica and South America politically, economically, and socially. Primarily agrarian civilizations, their lives, beliefs, and technological advancements stemmed from their dependence on agriculture. As theocratic societies, the civilizations were unified under a ruler who held a position equivalent to God. Caste system was defined with priests and nobles at a higher level than the commoners and peasants. However, the position of women differed by culture and the economy from a matrilineal society in Mississippian to equal footing in the Mayan, polygenic in Aztec, to chosen women in the Incas. Religion was polytheistic. Religious sacrifices as atonement towards sins or to please gods were common. Yet the offerings varied from bloodletting, one's own blood, as in Mayans, to prisoners of war sacrifices in Atkins or children's sacrifices in Incas. One continuity was that these civilizations arose from small farming communities that had learned cultivation of crops, although most of the early civilizations in the Americas were hunter-gatherers. Mayan and Aztecs were descendants of the Olmecs. Incas emerged from the Moche of the Nazca Valley, and people from the fertile Cusco Valley. The Mississippian came from the mini breadbasket of the Mississippi River lowlands. Persia. Politics. Aztecs and the Inca empires had large, complex political structures. While the Mayan city-states were segregated, Aztec city-states were divided into provinces with no direct administration. However, local rulers acted as tribute collectors. Incas governed by dividing their territory into 4 provinces, each under a governor to collect taxes and impose the mita system. Economics. Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas traded internally and externally. Besides agricultural goods, gold, jade, and copper were traded by the Mayans. Aztecs were fierce warriors which grew rich because of tribute from conquered regions and trade. Command economy under the Incas involved control by the central government. Trade and the 25,000-mile-long highway, also called the Carpanon, was controlled by the state. Captive labor was used for construction of roadways and palaces. In less centrally controlled civilizations of Mayan and Aztec regions, prisoners of war and captives were used for religious sacrifices. Religion. Although post-classical civilizations in the Americas were polytheistic, unlike Aztecs who were able to integrate their culture sphere into a single state, Mayan pantheon had a collection of ever-evolving deities, male and female, with varying rituals because of independent city-states. The Incas believed in animism, as seen in Huaca, a monument or immense rocks that represented something revered. Incan kings were mummified. Society. Rigid society structure existed in these civilizations, where captives were enslaved in Mississippian, Aztec, and Inca and offered in sacrificial rituals in Mississippian and Aztecs. The role of women differed in culture. Mississippians had a matrilineal system where land was passed to the son of the sister. In Aztecs, the woman could take the role of the priest, healer, merchant, or scribe and were educated. In Aztecs, children were schooled until 15 and farmers could go to school to improve their station. Innovation. Warawaru, Chinampas, and aqueducts of Aztecs and Incas helped with irrigation. Mississippian woodhenge, Mayan observatories, hard lifts of the Mayans and Aztecs, and the Carpanon of the Aztecs were some of the other advancements. Art and architecture. The Mississippians built mounds as large as 100 football fields called Cahokia. The Olmec, Mayans, and Aztecs, as well as the Incans, built pyramids to house their deities and bury their kings. The tradition of court theater included both tragic and comic theater. Some poetry and music was played on reed instruments also existed. Bookend 2. Even at their peak, the civilizations in the Americas were primarily dependent on agriculture and isolated with a comparatively lesser degree of interaction with the outside world. As a result, these civilizations in the Americas perished due to drought, environmental collapse, and to European diseases.
1.5 Africa from 1200 to 1450. Prior to state building in Africa, Islam was beginning to become a major religion in not only Asia but also around the world. It began to spread to Northeast Africa through the seas of the Byzantine Empire by the Arab armies in 641 BCE, and it spread to the Northeast African countries by the Arab armies. But then at the same time, because the countries in Africa were communicating with each other, trading, it began to spread to Western countries such as Ghana and Mali. With Islam came both achievements, but then also conflicts. One of those achievements was the creation of Swahili. It is a mix between Arabic and Bantu language, and it was a result of Arabic armies trying to communicate and teach the ways of Islam to the Bantu people, but there was a language barrier between them. So what they did, they created a new language with a mix of Arabic and Bantu grammatical structures. That way they could communicate with each other. At the same time, Islam created conflict with Axum because they were neighboring countries, the Muslim Turks and the Askamites were neighboring countries, but the fact that the Askamites were Christian while the Muslim Turks were of course Muslim, their ideas, morals, and philosophies, they were very conflicting. So this caused problems with communication, trade, and just overall made them very unfriendly towards each other. Lastly, in Africa, there was quite a large tolerance of religious freedom, and oftentimes the king would convert to a different religion rather than like a different religion from his civilians and stuff like that, or even sometimes the king himself didn't convert to Islam um, while the civilians would, because like he could. The king was most times very welcoming to people trying to spread Islam, and it overall made Africa a very diverse and diversely religious place. Timeline. So Ethiopia was one of the first civilizations. It started in 400 BC to 1400 AD, and it was made of Askamites and Solomons who were traders along the Red Sea. They moved inland due to the spread of Islamic merchants, from Asia, and they eventually let in and were let inside, and it created like a state, a colony together in Africa. Zanj. So this was when, the legend says that a Persian sailor was uh, brought down to the coast of East Africa, and his 6 sons each settled on one of the his 6 sons each settled on one of the islands, and they all eventually became very large centers of trade. And because they were East African countries, but they were also Persian, Swahili was very prominent in these areas as well. Um, in 400 AD to 10,000 AD, Ghana emerged as a civilization. They were very close to a neighboring state, which was abundant with gold. So they were able to make a name for themselves and put themselves on the map because they were known as the land of gold. They were able to use this as in trade power because gold was a very rare substance at the time and it was mostly found in Africa. So this attracted people. It also made them known on the map as people to trade with. Mali arose after the fall of Ghana. It was very similar to it. They also were based on gold and stuff like that, and they were an Islamic state because of their one of their very famous rulers, Mansa Musa, was Islam, and he would often invite priests and Islamic priests to come down and teach the ways of Islam. And lastly, Zimbabwe, from 1000 AD to 14,000 AD. It was one of the greatest achievements in Africa. Great Zimbabwe was a very flourishing country, and they were like on kind of not necessarily the edge, but they were kind of close to rivers, so they were able to like trade, and they were also very advanced in technology and stuff like ironworking as well. This is a timeline of Africa's state building, and it starts in 3100 BC and goes all the way to 1600 AD. So in 3100 BC, the ancient Egyptian civilization is established. It was one of the very first civilizations and kind of paved the way for all those civilizations which come after. And then in 2300 BC, the ancient Nubian civilization was found, and they were also known as the Kush Empire, but they were, it really could have been either one of them, either the ancient Nubian civilization or the ancient Egyptian civilization first, but they were one of the very first civilizations in Africa. And then in 1070 BC, Nubia becomes the Kush Empire as the Egyptian Empire begins to like lose their power and dissolve, but they don't completely fall and collapse quite yet. So in 30 AD, the Egyptian Empire does fall with the death of the Cleopatra because they don't have, not only are they losing power, but after the death of her, they just weren't able to recover. Then in 50 AD, Africa is really put on the map as major traders because East Africa becomes part of the established trading network between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and that is mostly East Africa at that time. In 350 AD, the Kush are conquered by the Ascanites in East Africa, and the Ascanites do eventually also get conquered, but as for right now, the Nubian Empire has fallen, and the Nubian or the Kush Empire has fallen, and the Ascanites are now in place of East Africa. In the 5th century AD, Ghana emerges as one of the first noticeable civilizations in West Africa because they were filled with gold and they were able to use that as a way to put themselves on the map for major traders. In 641 CE, like I said before, the Byzantine Empire is seized by Arab forces via the Nile River, and they are finally brought to an end after their reign for 2 centuries. This led to the spread of Islam because, the Arab armies were coming down and they were using this as a way to spread Islam to East African and Western countries eventually. In the 7th to 8th centuries AD, this is when the land of Zanj emerged, and it was basically when a Persian sailor and his 6 sons came down to the east coast of Africa, and each one of his sons settled on the islands, 6 of the islands along the east coast of Africa, and eventually these islands became major trading centers, and it once again put Africa on the map as a major trader in the trading network between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. From 1100 AD to 1550 AD, the Great Zimbabwe civilization is established. They become very advanced in architecture and just technology overall, and they are put like one of the most successful African civilizations to this day. In 1100 AD, Ghana collapses, but this also gives way for smaller states like Mali and Songhai to arise as Islamic civilizations. Mali specifically would go on to become a very Islamic civilization because of Mansa Musa, who was a Muslim who often invited priests and people of that sort down to Mali to preach and teach about the ways of Islam. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Swahili emerged because the Arabs and the Bantu people were interacting with each other, and they had to find a way to talk to each other, so they created Swahili as a way to teach the ways of Islam and just interact overall. And then by the end of this time period, Ethiopia, Assam, they were the only places with who hadn't been conquered by Christianity, while most places had been converted to Christianity. And Adal actually launched an attack on Ethiopia to get their ivory and goods because Ethiopia was so large in the trading network between the Red and the Mediterranean Sea that they wanted it. And this eventually backfired because Ethiopia, was a very powerful country, so they ended up fighting a 14-year-long holy war, but eventually Ethiopia does fade and becomes less powerful than they were before, and then it eventually does collapse. CTOT and global context. In terms of global context, one thing that was happening around the world and also in Africa was basically the traveling of goods and ideas via the Silk Road. So an example of goods being passed on the Silk Road would be Ethiopia. They were using the Silk Road to transport ivory, rhinoceros horn, salt, all those exotic goods which you would only find in Africa to places as far as China and everywhere in Asia, and they were using this as profit to build their civilizations and to just make their civilizations very wealthy. And then an example of ideas being spread on this by the Silk Road would be, the spread of Islam. starting in 641 CE, they came via the Silk Road down to East Africa and were able to conquer that place and eventually become help convert them to Muslims, and eventually that did spread all around Africa. So that was another example of ideas being spread, and even just literature and philosophy was also spread from Asia down to East Africa and eventually to West Africa as well. And then one continuity during this period, like I said, was the spread of Islam by monks and scholars. Islam had been spreading since the very early ages, and it was spreading amongst Asia, amongst that entire East Asia and the Middle East, amongst that entire section, and then eventually, towards 641 CE, like I said before, it began to spread down to East Africa, West Africa, and eventually in lots and lots of places in Africa became Muslim states and countries. Persia. So for politics, politics were mostly based on lineage groups. So if you had a lineage group, that automatically puts you, at the top in society. And rather than there being a central king or anything like that, it was more of decentralized, where it was villages, and their often elderlies were at the top. But if that wasn't the case, then lineage groups and clans were some way that you could figure out where a person would be in society. So economics, like I said before, because they had stuff like salt, rhinoceros horn, ivory, gold, they were able to take off as major traders in the Silk Road and stuff like that, and that really put Africa and the countries on the map as major traders, and they were able to use this profit that they made to not only benefit the king, but also to build structures, to build mosques, and just many great architectural structures that are still there to this day. Religion. Islam did become, because of the spread via the Silk Road, Islam became the main religion in Africa. Ascom and Ethiopia were one of the only the only two countries who were still Christian. But religion, eventually, Islam took over the entirety of Africa, and this was also supported by people like Mansa Musa, who invited scholars down to come teach Malayans about the ways of Islam and the morals of being a Muslim. So for society, there wasn't necessarily a really organized class structure in most African societies. It was more of just lineage groups. So at the top would be, sometimes it depends on the society, but sometimes it would be the king, his men, his noblemen, and then it would be commoners, and then slaves or prisoners of war who worked around. They would most likely be at the bottom. And prisoners of war, slaves, often had really difficult lives, and I guess they didn't make much profit, and they had to be kept where they were because they couldn't do anything without the profit that they would be being given, and the food and shelter they would be being given as slaves who worked. And then there were other cases where political structures were based on lineage groups, and this would be clans and lineage groups up top. Men under them, women under them, and then slaves, of course, are still at the bottom. Technology and innovation. This was the House of Wisdom, and other centers were revived through the spread of Islam, and just scholars who were spreading the knowledge from East Asia down into Africa. So all of the technology, all that stuff, ironworking became prominent in many states because of the Berbers. They produced copper and introduced it to people to create, and using copper they were able to create stronger iron tools and weapons, which were used for agriculture, building, and many grandiose structures such as pyramids, pillars, and palaces. Lastly, art. Um, Art was a way of expressing culture and history for those who didn't know much of it. Things like rock paintings, wood carvings, and metal figurines were ways to express African culture and history. Oftentimes, when bards couldn't remember everything or stuff like that, they could look back at whether it was art on walls or even like traditional music and dancing as ways to express how their gods carry themselves and how the gods were represented. Because oftentimes gods would be represented through dance and through vocals. So they were able to learn more about their culture through the representation of art. And that's why it was so important to be kept inside of those African countries, because without it they most likely wouldn't have known a lot about their culture in the way it was before they were there. And lastly, after Africa reached its peak, the Atlantic slave trade did begin because of European colonization. Dutch and just Europeans in general began to reach the Cape of Africa and colonization begins. And because of colonization, devastation was brought to many countries because of germs, and then also culture was lost because they were forced to live in the manner that the Europeans wanted them to because they were considered uncivilized. Most countries did get colonized. The only ones which didn't get colonized were Ethiopia and Liberia. And because of the Europeans, many great civilizations did collapse because they could just not fight back against the Europeans who had like steel and guns, and they were just outnumbered and outpowered oftentimes by the Europeans.
Introducing Unit 1.6 Europe from 1200 to 1450. Book at number 1, starting us off for Europe. Europe came after the collapse of the Han, who fell due to political chaos. For the most part, previously, Europe had been under the rule of the Romans. The Roman Empire had grown to become one of the most influential forces before its collapse in the 5th century. The Great Schism arose between the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox Church in 1054 AD, gave way for the new Germanic kingdoms to arise and allowed the power of the Christian Church to increase in political power. Oops, gonna go back. Here's our timeline all the way back in 31 BC all the way to 1600 AD. In 27 BC, the great ancient Roman Empire begins their reign and expansion in Europe. In 476 the ancient Roman Empire collapsed under the hands of the foreign barbaric tribes. Nomadic tribes entered Europe in the 6th century, and the fallen Roman Empire was replaced by the king-ruled Germanic kingdoms, whatever it is. In 527 AD, Justinian I becomes the emperor of the Eastern Roman of the Byzantine Empire. Charlemagne began to expand the Carolingian Empire, whatever that says. The pronunciation isn't important, but the message is. Empire into Central and Western Europe. In 1053 AD, the Catholic Church disagreed on how Christian symbols should be represented throughout art. This led to a split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. Hence, the Eastern Orthodox. The Magna Carta was signed as a result of the Civil War and the first time that the king's power within a society could be limited. From 1337 to 1453 AD, the Hundred Years' War was fought between England and France. I'm not sure why that wasn't added. England loses mainland Europe. Not again. In 1346 to 1352 AD, the devastating Black Plague swept through Europe, killing millions of people. It was carried via the pneumonic plague and rats. Pneumonic plague and rats, and was almost, if not always, fatal. The global context. In terms of global context, one change that is significant in the loss of power of the church and and most of Western Europe goes into Dark Ages. Black Death brought an end to many prosperous eras in the continent, unfortunately. This took effect to lots of development, but it did bring a, what's it called, influx to religion in different cultures, because a lot of people wanted religious guidance through this terrible time. Black Death brought an end to many prosperous eras on these continents. Both bubonic plague, spread by rats and fleas, and the pneumonic plague, airborne spread, decimates the population of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Bubonic plague also spread to different countries throughout infested ships that traveled along the vastly used maritime trade routes. By the end of the plague, tenant farmers had lost many workers, leaving harvests absent, and the world population had been reduced about 100 to 115 million. Some people say around 60 million people had died throughout Europe, although that source does vary from around 40 to 60, which is quite a big difference. Ice Age, plague, Hundred-Year Wars, social unrest, and decline of church led West Europe to the Dark Ages, which is the term that we now refer to it as. A continuity in Europe would be the spread of Islam. Because of religious persecution in England, France, Spain, and Portugal, people often fled to Eastern Europe to seek religious freedom. This continued the spread of Islam throughout the world because the refugees could spread their faith and knowledge with the natives of where they went. Plus, with their proximity to the Muslim Turks, they were ought to have picked up some of their culture, whether it was art, architecture, literature, and or philosophy. As Muslims traveled throughout the globe, they brought and spread their religion to the societies in which they stayed. Persia, 1 out of 2. During 1250 to 1400 AD, Western Europe had mannerism, and mannerism had many classes within it, too much to sum it up, and therefore I put this image here which basically sums it up. The Pope and the Church and the monarchs are really even, although there were many different power struggles that led to many different conflicts, which were usually known as the Great Schism. That was the big one. At the bottom here we have peasants and serfs that would work the land for knights, vassals, and nobles. And merchants, farmers, and craftsmen could usually live on their own land and do their own things because they were self-sufficient. Knights and vassals worked for nobles, and the nobles owned land, where monarchs were like kings and queens, and the Pope and the Church were God divined and had ultimate power until the Magna Carta. E for economics. Gold and silver were used frequently as the mainstream currency throughout Europe. Trade routes had been damaged by the now incredibly powerful Mongols, however they eventually became repaired and trade became much bigger than it had ever been beforehand. This spark in trade increased the economy significantly, however the increase of trade and people in the market would eventually lead to the mass spread of the bubonic plague, which was earlier talked about. R for religion. Christianity was obviously a significant part of Europe's economy, social structure, and culture, and most importantly, beliefs. During the plague, like many crises, many people flocked to religion for answers on why such terrible things were happening. Because of the plague, hundreds of different strands of Christianity appeared, all with very similar ideals, but also different in their own unique ways. This Persia continued. As for society was very complex during the medieval period, with weak central authority. Feudalism prevailed, with different classes within the social class. There were peasants or serfs, merchants, knights or vassals, nobles and lords. Kings were essentially rich lords. Christianity influenced who was at the very top of the social class. Christianity influenced who was at the top of the social class. I don't know why I said that twice. Peasants were tied to land. Almost 60% were serfs and worked for fiefdoms. Knights provided military support to the lords and kept them safe and everybody that lived within the walls. Merchants could make enough money throughout trading to support themselves. The top of the social class had essentially unlimited power and unlimited money until the Magna Carta, which was signed and put into effect in 1215 AD. I for technology innovation. Unfortunately, technology and innovation was not significant in Western Europe. As urban centers arose, daily hygiene got worse, increasing the disease and deaths, which eventually led to the bubonic plague spreading mainstream. Churches were the centers of learning, hospitals and hotels or inns for travelers. Earlier Eastern Europe and Byzantines was thriving with production of silk workshops and metalworks. An A for art. Cathedrals were incredibly common. Gothic architecture as seen in Notre Dame was replaced with more rounded domed architecture as seen in the Florence Cathedral of Brunelleschi, whatever that is called. Doesn't matter. Hagia Sophia is an example of the Greek Orthodox Church during this period. Figurine, idolatry, and mosaic and frescoes. Whatever that. Again, I'm pretty sure that pronunciation isn't completely important. And these were all used in the Eastern Europe. Basically, the point is that art was very big and that Christianity showed their religious beliefs and how dedicated they were to them through art, which still stands. A lot of it still stands today. And to wrap it up, book number 2 of Europe. For the most part, Eastern Europe is becoming religiously diverse with Islam, Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodox and Judaism. This is a result of cultural diffusion through scholars and literature, as well as many different religions being driven out of England, France, Spain, and Portugal. The Mongols would eventually conquer a large portion of Europe to form a Khanate, whatever that is called. Later, this would be defeated by Ivan the Great, a Moscow-based ruler, and all the nobles who allied with him. Kievan Rus became a major trading center due to its position between the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and Scandinavia. That was the end of Europe, and now we have moved on to the comparison. Both China and Dar al-Islam during the post-classical era underwent significant changes in trade, economy, and society. In both cases, their rapid growth was because of some strategic or administrative policies. China had a structured bureaucracy and imposed taxes on territories. Dar al-Islam also imposed taxes on non-Islamic people, such as Buddhists and Muslims, mostly Muslims. Religion played an important role in establishing bureaucracy in China as the backbone to the mediocrity system. In case of Islam, Sharia law was used for governing. There was a difference. In China, Buddhism came through missionaries and merchants that came to China. In case of Islam, it spread to other regions, and merchants were seen in a prestigious light in fostering economic growth. Unlike China, Chinese contributed to trade through lug sale, junk, paper money, and the banking system. Dar al-Islam improved upon saddles and tahao, whatever that is called. Education, learning, and knowledge were of prime importance in both societies. Chinese were leaders in paper, printing, and bookbinding. Islam borrowed knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Indian classics, translated, and made them available to scholars within and outside their region. Despite the economic prosperity in both civilizations, economic and political opportunities for women did not exist, and patriarchy was dominant. This has brought an end to the Unit 1 test review. Lots of content was covered, including everything that was mentioned at the start. That includes developments in East Asia, Dar al-Islam, aka the House of Islam, South and Southeast Asia, and the Americas, Africa, and finally Europe. Credits for Ariman, Oni, Paul, and Elias, who finished the slideshow. And that is the end of the Unit 1 test review.